Hello. Welcome back to the study of the book, Discovering Your True Self, A Guide for the Journey. My name is Steve Langford. I'm the author of the book, and I'll be your guide in this study of the book. This is the fourth study in the series. In the very first study, we looked at the concept of the true self and how it stands over against the false self, or what I call the constructed self. In the second session, we looked at those components that go into the creation of this constructed self, those building materials we use to manufacture this self that the world told us we needed to be. And we looked at the byproducts, that is the impact that the constructed self has upon our lives as individuals and the impact it has upon our culture. In the third study, we looked at how anxiety is the driver behind the constructed self. We looked at how anxiety arises out of those emotional needs that are woven into the fabric of our emotional DNA. We saw how that those needs become the basis of fear, and that primary need and that dominant fear that each of us has then becomes the anxiety out of which we live and which drives the constructed self, the persona that we manufactured. In this session, the fourth session, we're going to shift our attention away from the constructed self. Now, it was important that we explore the constructed self. It was important that we looked at all of those components that we use to manufacture this self. It was important that we understand and recognize the anxiety that drives it, because until we understand it, until we can recognize it, it controls us. We just automatically live out of it. It shapes who we are, and it deceives us into believing that that is who we are, when in reality, it is not who God created us to be. For the true self is who God created us to be when God created us in the divine likeness. Now, this shift in focus is a shift to thinking about a process of spiritual transformation. It is a transformation in which our hearts and our minds are changed. And in this process, we move away from this anxiety and this anxiety-based living that the constructed self embodies. We move away from the constructed self, and we move away from the thinking that props up this constructed self. This process of transformation is a spiritual journey. It is what happens as we intentionally walk in relationship with God as beloved children and as the followers of Jesus. It is the transformation that happens as we are intentional about learning the ways of God that Jesus taught, the ways of the kingdom, and then seeking to put those ways into practice. It is the transformation that takes place as we not just learn truth, but then try to live out of the truth that we are learning. Now, the Spirit of God is our companion on this journey and our helper. The Spirit leads us on this journey. And the Spirit teaches us the truths of Christ, the truths that Jesus taught. And then the Spirit empowers us to live out those truths. Now, the truths that we discover that Jesus taught, the truths of the kingdom, challenge this old way of thinking that the constructed self lives out of. It challenges this merit-based thinking, the us-them thinking, the better-than, less-than thinking, the either-or, black and white thinking, this what's in it for me spirit. The truths that the Spirit teaches us confronts those, and then the Spirit empowers us to move beyond them, to live out of the truths that Jesus taught. And as the Spirit is empowering us and we are learning to live into and out of these great truths, the transformation begins to take place deep inside of us, in our hearts and in our minds. we'll find that the Spirit of God will bring us to a place of healing of those old emotional needs, those old emotional memories, those old emotional wounds that give birth to the anxiety out of which we live. And we'll discover that the Spirit will set us free from the power of the constructed self, the persona out of which we live. And the Spirit will nurture into fullness, into discovery, and then into development, the true self, that person that God created us to be. Now, this spiritual process of transformation has a very simple formula that we follow. The pattern of growth follows this formula without fail. There's three parts to the formula. It is from, into, by means of. We move from the old. We move from the old ways of thinking, the old ways of living. We move into that which is new, that to which the Spirit of God is calling us. We live into the new. And the by means of is that which propels us from the old into the new. The biblical writers actually speak of this formula. In the book of Ephesians, chapter 4, we hear the description of this formula. Listen from the New Revised Standard Translation as I read from Ephesians chapter 4. I'm going to begin at verse 22. Now, the context begins at verse 17. But I want to begin at verse 22. You were taught to put away your former way of life, your old self, corrupt and deluded by its lust, and to be renewed in the spirit of your minds, and to clothe yourselves with the new self, created according to the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness. Now listen to what the biblical writer said. The biblical writer said, we move from the old self. We move into the new self. And the means by which we do that is by the renewing of the mind. The old self is described as deluded, living out of false truths. And that's what the constructed self does. It lives out of a way of thinking that ends up contributing to its own self-destruction. So the biblical writer says, to put away, the imagery is that of taking off clothes or taking off a jacket. Put away, take off your former way of life, the way of life that we lived when we lived out of this anxiety-driven, constructed self. And to clothe yourselves with the new self. And notice that this new self is described as being created according to the likeness of God. See, here's the beauty. As we walk in this relationship with God as the followers of Christ, the Spirit of God begins to grow us into the likeness of Christ, so that the beauty of God's nature and character begins to be ingrained into the very depths of our being, transforming our hearts and our minds. And it is that process of growing in the likeness of Christ that helps us to discover the true self. And it is that process that releases the true self so that the true self can come into fullness. Now, the means by which that happens is located between those putting away, putting off, and putting on. Verse 23 says, be renewed in the spirit of your mind. Learn to think differently. Learn to think from the perspective of what Christ taught. Or to use Paul's language, put on the mind of Christ, so that the ways of God then begin to shape how we think, so that how we think then determines how we live. We find this same concept in the book of Colossians chapter 3, where in the middle of verse 9 the writer says, seeing that you have stripped off the old self with its practices. Again, the old self with its way of life, the things that it did. And have clothed yourself with the new self. Old self, new self. But listen to what it says about the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge according to the image of its creator. You see, there's the by means of. The means by which this putting off, putting on takes place is by being renewed in knowledge, by learning to think differently, learning to think from the perspective of what Jesus taught, the putting on of the mind of Christ. But what I like about the Colossians passage is what it says next. In that renewal, in that putting off and that putting on, there is neither Greek or Jew, no longer circumcision or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave and free, but Christ is in all and is all. Notice that in this true self, we move beyond the old us, them ways of thinking. We move beyond that comparing and competing in which we consider ourselves better than the others and that the others are less than. We move beyond that either or black and white way of thinking, and that leads us to that spirit, that attitude that says I'm right and you are wrong. As this process of spiritual growth takes place, as the mind is being renewed, as we are learning the truths of God that the Spirit teaches us, we move away from those old ways of thinking. We move into a new way of living. In his letter to the churches of Rome, the Apostle Paul communicates this same understanding. In Romans chapter 12, verse 2, Paul says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. There is that three-part formula. Do not be conformed. The original language that Paul used, the original Greek, carries the idea of stop being conformed. The idea is that the world has already conformed us. I like the way J.B. Phillips translates that. Don't let the world squeeze you into its mold. If we were to apply the Greek to that, it would be stop letting the world squeeze you into its mold. Do you hear that constructed self in which the world or our social groups told us what we needed to be if we wanted to be accepted and valued within that group? Stop being conformed to the pattern of this world and be transformed. Transformed. Put off the old self, the constructed self, the old way of life, and be transformed. Put on the new self. The word transformed that Paul uses is the word from which we get our word metamorphosis, the description of the process that the caterpillar goes through to emerge as a butterfly. Paul is saying, let's let the true self emerge and blossom so that we can see the beauty of who it is that God created us to be. And then, of course, there is the means. Stop being conformed, be transformed. How? Again, by the renewing of your mind. By learning to think differently. By learning to live out of the truths that Christ taught. Now, this process of spiritual transformation is what we experience as we walk in relationship with God. Now notice it's a process. it happens a bit at a time. It doesn't happen all at once. We grow just as we grow physically from an infant to a toddler to a preschooler to a school-age child to a preteen to the teen to the young adult to the adult. So we grow in Christ the same way spiritually. We make spiritual progress, learning, growing, and developing. But here's the kicker. There is an inherent resistance to this process. There is something inside of us that resists the transformation that the Spirit of God wants to do inside of us. You see, the old is what is familiar. The old is what is comfortable. The old way is what we know. And the new is a challenge. The new is different. The new is unfamiliar. And therefore the new is uncomfortable. And there's something inside us that prefers comfort to the challenge. So what is it then that helps us to overcome this resistance? Well, as the followers of Jesus, there is our commitment to learn and to live the ways of God that Jesus taught. And in fact, in each one of these three passages, there is a call. The Ephesians 4 passage at verse 17 says, no longer live as the Gentiles live. The Colossians passage says to put to death those former ways. And here Paul says, I beseech you by the mercies of God, present yourselves as a holy and living sacrifice. It is, the motivation is that call, that commitment that we have to walk in relationship with God as beloved children, as the followers of Jesus, learning to live the ways of God that Jesus taught. But there's another kind of motivation. Sociologists tells us that there are two kinds of motivations that cause us to leave the old and go to the new. The first is a dissatisfaction or a disillusionment with the old. The other is the allurement, the attraction of the new. Quite often, there has to be something that makes us unhappy with, dissatisfied with the old. Sometimes it takes pain to get our attention and to push us out of the old. It's like the mother eagle pushing the baby eagle out of the nest when it's ready to fly. The nest is the familiar, the comfortable, it's the only thing we've known. But there comes a time to move beyond that so that we can discover the thrill of that for which we were created. Or to use the imagery of the baby eagle, the thrill of soaring, of flying. Pain is often that which propels us out of the old and into the new. So what does this look like? What does this transformation look like? Well, it is rooted in the renewing of the mind. It is rooted in learning to think with the mind of Christ. It is rooted in learning to live out of a concept of grace rather than merit-based living. It is learning to live, to move beyond the us-them thinking so that we can begin to see all as God's creation and all as beloved children of God. It is learning to move beyond the better than and the less than thinking, the either or black and white thinking, the I'm right, you're wrong mentality. All of those components that we use to manufacture the constructed self have to be identified and moved beyond. We learn to move beyond our focus upon others so that we can learn to be self-aware and manage ourselves and our emotional reactivity and the anxiety that drives us. We learn to move beyond that self-effort of trying to measure up so that we can discover how to learn and how to grow and how to make progress through development. the old self, the new self, the constructed self, the true self. The Spirit of God is at work in our life to move us beyond this old constructed self, the anxiety that drives us, and the thinking that props it up, so that we can learn to live out of the truths of the kingdom that Jesus taught. For in the living out of those great truths, we begin to discover who it is that God created us to be. And the Spirit nurtures that true self into a maturity that sets us free to live who it is that God created us to be, and to use our gifts and our passions to make a difference in the lives of others. Well, that brings us to the end of this session. In fact, it brings us to the end of this first section of the study. The first section was composed of these 4 videotapes. We'll move next to part 2, to the second section in the book, in which we apply this principle of from, into, by means of. And in 5 different sessions, we'll look at 5 areas that we move from the old constructed self ways into the God-shaped ways of the true self, and the means by which we get there. This is part 2 in the book. Now, this is your time.